Okay, welcome everyone to our penultimate Critical Antiquities Workshop for the year. There's one more in early December, and I'm very happy and thrilled this in this session that we have Andrew Benjamin, who for many of us needs a little introduction. One of, I think it's fair to say, one of Australia's most preeminent philosophers. A very prestigious critical theorist who has written many works, many books, many articles, many book chapters on Heidegger. Hannah Arendt is an international authority on Walter Benjamin. I mean, I could spend the next half hour listing the honours and the prestige. Emeritus Professor of Philosophy or Critical Theory at Monash, has held visiting professorships around the world, and we're very lucky that he is joining us. I'll also just add a special mention that Andrew has just finished his honours degree, having returned in retirement to study Latin, shall we say, properly, and has done an honours degree on Seneca's Medea. And is that been submitted? Oh, and so that is really worth congratulating Andrew on too, and I'm sure that is going to be a masterpiece. Today, Andrew is going to talk to us about some of his readings of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And so without any ado, I'm going to turn now to introduce the talk, Living in Peace with Animals, Pythagoras' Speech, from Ovid's Metamorphoses 15.
Well, thank you, Gordon. Just as a preamble, this paper is one of a number of essays I'm writing, put together on the concept of injury. And I'm quite interested in injury, because which I understand, as I'll say more on the paper, in its etymological sense is linked to inuria and therefore injustice, and which I take the in of injury to be appurative. So to injure someone is to deprive them of justice, and therefore the response to injury, though this is an area of debate for me, is not care, but is the combination of care and law, or care and justice. And so there's a very interesting Italian philosopher called Bellucci who's written a wonderful book called Cura e Giustizia, and I take a lead very much from what she's doing in thinking you can't have a concept of care without a concept of justice. So implicit in this whole project is trying to think about injury. So what I've done is write a series of essays, of which this is one, trying to trace the concept of injury, and indeed the word injury, inuria, in a series of Latin texts. Seneca's Medea, Pythagoras, and more recently, though it's now being published, an analysis of the Niobe figure in Ovid. Okay, so let me begin. The implicit philosophical problem that this engagement with the speech made by Pythagoras in Book 15 of Ovid's Metamorphoses is attempting to address is not one that until recently has been directly central to classical scholarship on Ovid. And the one exception is the work of Julius Sissa, who's written a number of very important papers on Ovid and vegetarianism, Ovid and the body. The problem has a specific form. It pertains to the way in which empathy as an organizing concept, delimiting the nature of relationality, one that is equally a concern for both the human and the animal other, encounters a limit. The limit emerges at the point at which the affective has to yield its place to an engagement with justice. This involves the imagination in Kant's sense, insofar as it is the imagination that allows for the particular to be judged. The reason for approaching this question, the way the limit of empathy gives rise to the need for judgment through classical sources, is to underscore the position that overcoming violence in the name of an opening to peace has continued to show itself within both the history of philosophy and the history of literature. And indeed, that's really one of my projects, is to try and show how the ancient world actually is demonstrating and engaging problems And even though they're not resolved necessarily, they are engaged. And I find that very interesting. Integral to that overcoming is demonstrating that the nature of the gap between violence and peace necessitates the intervention of processes of education that are themselves inextricably bound up with the possibility of justice. While violence leading to the taking of life has a disarming ubiquity, both the history of philosophy and the history of literature contain a continuity of countermeasures. And one which I'll refer to here is the engagement with Lucretius' particular religion in Book 1, but especially the argument in Book 5, and equally Kant's Perpetual Peace paper. I see a real affinity between these two. In the specific case of the arguments of vegetarianism in Book 15, the Metamorphoses, this envisages a form of reading that brings with it an inevitable complex of considerations. A literal reading of the lines in question, lines 64 to 78, would end with the claim that vegetarianism is necessary because of the risks of cannibalism. The movement of soul between humans and animals, a specific instance of metempsychosis, may mean that the consumption of an animal might then entail the consumption of a human that had already existed first time. What has to be avoided is dining from what he refers to as theistis mensis on these tables. And here his choice of vocabulary is important. He writes cumulus viscera, though I discovered last night that Hardy thinks my translation is wrong. So I'm going to defer to Hardy, who's probably right compared to me. But I think the point remains. I mean, I translated this as do not, neve plus a subjunctive, do not, overload Theistian tables with body parts. But you could also translate it as let us not load up our viscera, our innards, with Theistian banquets, which is Hardy's translation. Philosophically, the point's the same. Philologically, it's not. So that I think it's sort of interesting. I'm sure Hardy's right, I'm not, but it's intriguing to see that. I discovered this late last night. The party's commentary has just been published. It's the volume 3 down. It's extraordinary. Bodies are equated with body parts in the presentation of a piling up. Bodies, that which had been living, is now a selection of parts heaped on a table. While the claim made here is the final registration of the fluidity of souls between all living beings, it builds on one of the most famous lines in the speech, when he states, omnia mutantur nihil interit, everything changes, nothing dies. There is a contextual claim that will allow for a continuity of reference to Thyestes, and yet what it indicates has greater extension, namely, that there is a fluidity of relation between the human and the animal, since in Ovid's terms, in the next slide, we are not bodies, but also winged souls. In other words, there is an excess that marks both the human and animal bodies that resists their reduction to mere bodies, and yet which maintains forms of distinct presence. So while animals and humans are distinct, their distinction is not simply in bodily terms, there's something that's shared. As such, neither an absolute differentiation nor a complete distinction can be maintained. It is the presence of bodies, however, that marks the point of departure. And it should be noted that this formulation already indicates the presence of a form of vulnerability, insofar as this doubled presence could be refused, and thus a body reduced to its presence as mere body. The reduction of the body to mere matter, which in philosophical terms is the elimination of a complex form of materialism in the name of a simple empiricism, eliminates the possibility that the material could ever be the locus of concern or care. It is this point that, as Heidegger recognized his engagement with the concept of care, Sorge, was already addressed by Huginus in his Fabula Pura. In the fable, the dispute over the name of the object fashioned by Cura was resolved by Saturn thus. I'll just read the English. Since Cura fashioned him from the stars, let Cura hold him or possess him for as long as he shall live. But since there is controversy about his name, let him be called Homo, since he seems to be made from the humus, the lama, and which is extraordinary, for me at least, reiteration of the Genesis story, where Adam and Adamah is now repeated by beginners. And I don't know enough to know why, but this story is, historically, it's what inspired Heidegger to develop the concept of Sorge, of care. And it's so interesting in that this exactly reiterates the Genesis story, insofar as the cura is, as it were, an immaterial presence within material. And so that's, for Heidegger, is what it enabled him to say that what we are by definition are carers, care. And Sorge, as in Latin, plays, in German, plays on this double sense, which we have in English to a certain extent, where Sorge can mean both care as I care for you, but as we say in English, I'm burdened by the cares of the world, which is the nasty part of cure. So we're always engaged. And so for Heidegger, Sorge and the notion of thrownness work together. It's sort of very interesting that it's the way in which there is something in us that's an immaterial presence and not material. The force of this resolution is it allows for the presence of cura, staged here through the use of Hossaidiat, just into subjunctive, followed by Vixeret, a future perfect, in yielding a conception of the body as the continual locus of the complex interplay of care and concern as part of bodily presence. His naming as homo is also given force. Again, and I think it's important to say this, by the use of another jussive subjunctive, vocetur. So the language is actually staging what's important. What this means is that there is an ineliminable constitutive excess that remains as a possibility, which is a fundamental part of any definition of the body. So it's that which is excessive, cura, which in some sense defines bodily presence. What human and animal bodies have in common is a life that can be taken, even though, and this is where the reference to cura in Venus and anima in Ovid is important, they cannot be identified merely with that life. However, they can be reduced to it. Hence the reference to an excess that has to be understood as vulnerable. Bodies, all bodies can be murdered. I think it's the next slide. No, it's not. Mark Crepon, in his recent book, Murderous Consent, argues that, and I quote, any relationship, moral or political, assumes from the beginning that we are prepared to heed the appeal of the other for attention, care, and help, as enjoined by his or her vulnerability and mortality. This holds without exception. I've underlined without exception. The presence of the formulation without exception will be interpreted here as a reference either to the way Kant uses the concept of the unconditioned in the second critique, or Derrida's implicit use of such exception formulations, such as unconditional justice or unconditional hospitality. One who argues without exception is the same force. As Crepon's analysis unfolds, this position loses its initially anthropocentric determination and is extended to the animal other. That latter occurs within a setting that in part recalls the work of the German philosopher Hans Jonas on responsibility, insofar as what is specific to the human is, and I quote, its ability to destroy the totality of relations that constitute the world that is proper to each species, including our own, and therefore to each animal singularly, end quote. Accepting Crepon's claim, made in relation both to vulnerability and the presence of a capacity to destroy, means that vulnerability cannot be separated from the presence of this particular human ability. Moreover, were the overall argument to be extended, the question of what counts as the enactment of this ability would need to be analysed. Part of the analysis would show that it always unfolds in relation to a set of regional practices, each having an inevitable specificity. For example, the presence of animal sacrifice in the Roman world would be such an instance, in part because sacrifice, as evidenced in Lucretius's De Rere Natura, is a contested practice. And yet if there is a generality at work within each specific instance, a generality yielding a ground of judgment, thus enjoining the work of the imagination, then it hinges on an understanding of vulnerability as integral to an ontological account, not just of human being, but of life, to reiterate Crepon's formulation, without exception. The softness of flesh means that it is inherently vulnerable to being wounded. However, such a formulation, despite its recourse to the apparently literal, merely sentimentalizes what is at stake. The concept of vulnerability, if it is to be useful, demands a more rigorous understanding. The contention here, and this following on from the work of both Hannah Arendt and Walter Benjamin, is that vulnerability can be understood as the potential for life to be reduced to what Walter Benjamin calls bloßes Leben, or mere life. Precisely because vulnerability can be explained in these terms, namely the terms set by the interplay between potentiality, a potential to destroy, and this form of reduction, vulnerability has to be understood as inherent to life. Vulnerability and care have to be brought together. As Martin Huth has argued, I quote, the concept of inherent vulnerability expresses the acknowledgement of the fact that we are all, by virtue of our bodily existence, dependent on and exposed to others, and not only vulnerable in exceptional situations. I think this is a very important point that he makes, and it builds partly also on Judith Butler's work. That what we are always already vulnerable. And therefore the question of justice is not the exceptional question, it's the question that attends our always present vulnerability. That's why to me the concept of injury is so important. Precisely because vulnerability brings with it an ineliminable universality, it attends the body. The argument has to be that the reduction in question brings with it the need to reposition the capacity to be wounded to one concerned with injury, whereas I said the latter, injury, needs to be linked to its Latin root, injuria, in which the prefix in functions as a form of privative. To be injured, therefore, is to be deprived of justice. Therefore, the questions that emerge are twofold. Firstly, there is the one that pertains to how to develop the links between vulnerability, potentiality, and injury. And the secondly, of injury, which is the result of what may be described as aboriginal vulnerability, can be equated with the privation of justice. What has to be examined is the relationship between vulnerability and the law. What is needed is an understanding of law as that which secures justice. If there is a normative dimension to vulnerability, then it is the ineliminable relation to such a conception of law that provides its location. These two questions frame the approach that will be taken to Pythagoras' speech in Ovid's Metamorphoses. A fundamental element of Pythagoras' speech draws on the critique of sacrifice in Lucretius. For Lucretius, the critique of sacrifice cannot be separated from the critique of religion. As he argues, religion has, I quote him now, given birth to acts that are sinful and impious. What? No. And that's from Book 1, line 83. What is important to note in Lucretius is his use of the word impious, impia. Implicit in the formulation is that religion has brought about a state of affairs in which it stands against an inherent form of propriety that pertains both to human and non-human animals, namely the demand to be treated justly. I'm taking impia now broadly as an act against some notion of inherent propriety, and therefore could be viewed as one that is unjust. And what is interesting is exactly the same oscillation between killing humans and killing animals that you find in Ovid, I would argue, comes from a Lucretian origin. Namely, Lucretius is equally concerned with how the killing of one will lead to, or as coterminous with the killing of the other. So it's not really an argument about animal rights, it's an argument that killing in general is that which must be opposed. Religion is injurious. Its acts are injurious in this precise sense. It is not just that animals die within the act of sacrifice. What matters from the Lucretian position is the inherent impiety of such acts. Ovid will use a similar term in his admonition against the eating of meat. No, that's not so. For Ovid, for Ovid's Pythagoras, eating animals is nefas, impious. The position is unequivocal. Pacite mortales, tapibus, tenare nefandus corpora. Refrain, mortals, from polluting your bodies with such impious feasts. The inclusive use of the second person plural imperative, pacite, refrain from, is fundamental. In this instance, it reinforces the coverage as well as the urgency of the demand. While the act of killing may be justified if animals menace human life, Ovid has Pythagoras even argued that such killings may occur without impiety. It remains the case that animals non epulanda fuerit should not have been eaten. For Ovid, and the claim is a specific one, they should not be killed to eat. In other words, they should not become meat. Part of the argument concerns, therefore, what may be described as the becoming meat of animals. And the becoming meat of animals, I want to argue, is the reduction of the animal to mere life. It's the corollary that we have in regards to human life. If I reduce you to being a slave, or if you are an object of absolute racism or sexism, I've reduced you to mere life. The equivalent in the animal world is the reduction of the animal to meat. And so the argument is to oppose, as it were, the meat industry, and therefore the becoming meat of animals. And I think this is exactly what Ovid is concerned, or Ovid has Pythagoras be interested in, is the becoming meat of animals. As part of the overall argument, Ovid invokes what he calls a vetus aetas, an earlier time, in which, as he states quite grammatically, humans nec polluit ora curore, did not pollute their mouths with blood. As a result, the word was plena pacis, full of peace. Now, if ora, the Latin word for mouth, is understood synectically here, as is often the case with the use of ora throughout Latin writing, and thus, while it has its literal meaning, it doesn't refer to mouth. What it actually refers to is the whole person. Then the refusal of meat, the refusal of pollution, would pertain not to the bloody mouth, but to human being in general. The bloody face would be a sign of an injurious life. Impiety would be acting injuriously. What is invoked in the actualization of the possibility of, what is invoked, therefore, is the actualization of the possibility of living in peace with animals, the definition of which is the suspension of any possibility that animals became meat. So the other part of this project is to link this to Kant's notion of peace, in which for Kant, peace between two nations is possible if both commit themselves to a type of republicanism, namely they both see themselves as being able to live together. So to live in peace with animals involves, in a sense, the concession on our parts not to reduce them to meat. So it's not merely to attribute to them rights, it's to go to the further extreme, and that's not equate them with mere life. Afterwards, mouths would no longer be bloody. Moreover, the argument is not centered on attachment to a golden age as a mythic possibility. This is to misread what Ovid's doing. The presence of peace also emerges after Pythagoras' speech. The next section, directly after the speech, begins with an account of Numa, the second king after Romulus, who was not only instructed by the words of Pythagoras. Numa is described as, got this slide? Is described as the one who brought a tribe accustomed to fierce war to the pacis artis, to the arts of peace. And artis here must be understood as a mode of life linked to peace, the practice of peace. Fundamental to this position is the formulation of the arts of peace, since what it indicates is the presence of a series of continuous practices. And here I think you have intimations of our sense of acting, which links peace to the continuity of human activity, rather than identified merely with the end of war, which I take it to be Kant's argument, that peace has nothing to do with the end of war. It has to do with an activity in which we commit ourselves to living in peace. In other words, the possible link between, on the one hand, the equation of animals with meat, and thus the suspension of the process of becoming meat on the other, the project of peace, is mediated in advance by the presence of education. And that's the coming to It's what happens when you're brought to a position. Education here is the process of being led to peace. It should be noted here that this formulation recalls, I think, a pivotal passage in De Re Natura, in which it is argued that overcoming a life devoted to violence does not yield an automatic opening to peace. There is an intervening step which is of fundamental importance. The next step in question involves the creation of a judicial system which, allowing for education, creates the setting where the presence of law can then be operative. In Lucretius's formulation, overcoming the violence of kings necessitates a movement, thus directed activity. He writes that having grown weary of violence as a consequence, some men taught how to create elected magistrates and have put in place laws in order that they might want to follow them. What is central in this passage is the reiterations of verbs of positive activity, docere, creare, constituere, the use of which entails that education resulted in the creation of a system of magistrates, and equally what might be understood as a system of rights, to which people would freely subject themselves. Lucretius's description culminates in the result clause, ut velent legibus utae. The use of ut plus the third person plural imperfect subjunctive reinforces the fact that becoming legal subjects would then occur as a result of such a setup. And again, I hope it's not labouring the point, but I think it's important that he uses a result clause in order to show that this is the consequence of science. It's written in the language, though I could be wrong. This is what I'm taking. Further, the use of velent, taken on its own, indicates that this outcome was both wanted and desired, which is the double sense of the word velent. Hence the related proposition that mortals would subject themselves freely to the law. And it is essential to recognize that this is a subject position that is not there innately, it is produced by the practice of education. Note in addition the way in which Lucretius describes the state of being entrapped with violence. Here's the next slide. Violence and injustice, and so here we get now we've got the word injuria. Violence and injustice entrap us in its nets. At work in this setting is a fundamental opposition that structures the way in which law is to be understood. Counterposed to jus, right, and lex, law, are vis, violence, and injuria, injustice, injury. They do not just limit the freedom to act, they emphatically come to define a specific form of life. Freedom is possible if freedom is only possible if there is the concomitant recognition of jus and lex in the place of both vis and injuria. The former undo the latter. The presence of jus and lex is the precondition for peace. Vis and injuria, on the contrary, render peace impossible. Next slide. This equally is a position held by Arendt. In the Tagebucher, she states that enacting the human being under the demand of justice, the unspoken, and the demand of Gerechtigkeit. And for me, it's very important that she uses the word Gerechtigkeit, because in it you hear Recht, you hear law. So Gerechtigkeit is very important. When she writes this in German, that's the word she's going to use, and it's Walter Benjamin's word equally, that he would juxtapose, he will use to dramatize for justice. Enacting the human being under the demand of justice and constantly tempted by the possibility of using violence to free himself from the compulsion of Anyakaya, bears political responsibility together with others. So necessity post. The argument here is that such a demand, thus the link between acting and justing, is not spontaneous. It is a position that emerges from the process of education. In Kantian terms, it would be the overcoming of what Kant refers to as enforced Unmündigkeit. As a sort of, and it's very interesting. Unmündigkeit is the word he uses in the Enlightenment paper, and it's what we have. It's an enforced silence, an enforced unworldliness. Though mundus in here, it's not meaning mundus, though I wanted to. So it's not unworldly, but it has that sense of an enforced silence, an enforced childishness and enforced inability to speak. Namely, the setting in which the incapacity to speak, overcome through the finding of a voice linked to the formulation sapere aude, resists any form of immediate overcoming. Audaciousness is an opening, it is not an end in itself. As has been suggested, the terms piety and impiety, in the context of both Lucretius and Ovid, need to be understood beyond the immediate setting provided by the presence of religion. Another setting is necessary. The contention here that is provided by linking both to the question of right. This becomes clear in one of the most important conclusions drawn in regard to the presence of metempsychosis. Ovid writes, this to my mind is such an important claim. Therefore, lest piety be conquered by the longings of the belly, refrain, I say as a seer, Vatican ornament, do not drive out related souls with impious slaughter. Let life be not nourished by life, something like that. On one level, what is going on in these lines is the proposition that has already been noted, namely that the souls of humans live on in animals, and therefore killing animals might be de facto killing human souls. And yet, there are important ambiguities in this formulation. It is always possible to interpret cognatus animas, related souls, as posing an affinity between the human and the animal. And the final line, with its emphatic jussive subjunctive alatua, which blurs any distinction between human life and animal life, can as a result be interpreted as claiming that the taking of life, which here would be an instance of the becoming meat of animals, should not be used to sustain life. The further important aspect of these lines is that the word kaides has the sense of murder or slaughter rather than simply killing. So it's a very emphatic claim. The further description of it as nefanda reinforces the point that this form of killing cannot be sanctioned, and thus it stands opposed to that which should have normative force. If the analysis were taken further, then the use of the formulation kaide nefanda, impious slaughter, in defining that which drove out related souls. And again, just to be boring, in grammatical terms, kaide nefanda, impious slaughter, functions as an additive means. So he's using a specific form of the language to make the point that he wants. Can be interpreted as identifying the presence of what I'm calling an injurious act. It is injurious precisely because the becoming meat of the animal is, as I argued, the reduction of the animal to mere life. In other words, the animal is not just wounded. What this then entails is that as a result of being injurious, the response has to be an appeal to that which, in recognizing the state of being injured, works as a result to secure justice. It is not difficult to note the affective force of the formulation, let life not be nourished by life. Nec sanguine sanguis alatur. However, precisely because what is at stake is a plea that reproduces the force of the imperative parkite, which is the imperative that opens and closes the entire Pythagoras speech. This imperative is repeated. Yields its place to a concern of justice, and thus to the role of the imagination in positioning any one particular as judge of all. The work of language with its enactment of the affective, and thus its presentation of the animal as both vulnerable and mortal, or to use Huth's formulation of having an inherent vulnerability, is that which marks the latter's limit by staging the ineliminable opening to judgment. And the final point. And if there is a final point, it's the last point. If there is a final point in which one of Ovid's formulations plays a significant role, then it can be located in the final section, final line of this section of Book 15. Ovid writes, ora colore vacem, alimentaque mitis capant. When Ovid states ora curore vac, the possibility of a mouth being devoid of blood needs to be interpreted not simply where once again ora functions as the entire body and then by extension human life. What is being proposed is a life devoid of blood, thus a life devoid of killing. If the oscillation between the killing of the human and the killing of the animals maintained, and this is the opening held throughout the speech, then what is being suggested is that a life of peace is one in which blood does not figure. It's blutlos, so it's bloodless. Excluded, therefore, is as much the project of sacrifice, the continual becoming meat of animals, and the relation between humans delimited by bloodletting. Now, the second half of the line involves the relationship between vitia and carpant. On one interpretation, carpant might be understood as the rendering of flesh. However, its juxtaposition with vitia undoes that possibility. Vitia means mild or gentle. There cannot be a mild or gentle tearing or rendering of flesh. As a result, carpant can be understood as gathering or plucking, evidence for which is also I find in Hardy's commentary. You notice that carpant here is he doesn't say it's mediated by meteor, I'm saying that, but it has this double sense of rendering or devouring flesh, but on the other hand, it means cultivating crops, or plucking things from bushes. In other words, it points to a relationship to plants and thus to acts of cultivation rather than the rendering of animals for meat. What is being suggested, therefore, by the way the line functions is an opposition between war and peace, and thus between blood and the bloodless. It does so in a way that contrasts two dramatically different forms of life, in which the question of the political is directly linked to the question, what are you having for dinner tonight? That's it. Thank you. Sorry.
Well, that was extraordinary reading of a close reading, a philological close reading of the text through a philosophical lens. I'm minded of what we were talking about yesterday, the relationship between philologia and philosophia, right? These are closely bound. Look, let's turn now to some questions. What we normally do is take a question from the floor, and then we take a question from the Zoom room. For those of you who are on Zoom, if you could place the letter Q in the chat, then I would be able to take you in the correct order in which you're asking the question. And I can either throw to you in Zoom, or you can even type the question in chat and I'll read it out if you prefer. So are there any questions from the floor first? Tristan.
Thank you, Andrew. I really enjoyed that. My question is, I guess, is becoming meat all of a piece? So some theorists, and I'm thinking of someone in our audience, Dinesh Waterwell, who think about this with the kind of Marxist historical materialist lens, want to say that there's an important distinction between pre-capitalist and capitalist modes of becoming meat, where industrialization is a kind of important distinction. And I guess your paper is suggesting that becoming meat ought to be something that isn't open to those kinds of distinctions, but isn't in itself injurious. And I wondered just what you would say to that more kind of historical materialist way of coming at the question.
That's a very good question, and I don't have a satisfactory answer. Obviously, I tend not to think that way. I tend to look at, I tend to be sort of slightly oblivious to that. Not that I have anything opposed to it, I'm sure, but I tend to put those historical questions to one side. And I suppose what I'm interested in is the recovery of moments within ancient philosophy that I think has a resonance. I mean, I'm also interested in ancient philosophy in itself, but I'm interested in this instance in how this argument, and it's not just Pythagoras, Plutarch will make similar sorts of arguments. Porphyry also makes a similar sort of argument. There is in the ancient world an argument about these issues. So my methodological approach, which is not to sound dismissive of others, I'm just not doing it, is to try and recover moments in the history of thought that speak to something that I take to be an issue in the present. And to me, the question of the meat industry is a question, and therefore I ask myself, does that have a history? Now, the person you cite can approach it that way. I tend to approach it this way. I'm not precluding one thing or the other. It's a disciplinary question, I suppose. As a philosopher, I'm interested in those moments in which someone has made the argument that, animals should not be reduced to, life should not be nourished by taking life. And it's interesting to me that and alatur is such an interesting verb because it also is where our word for lactate is, where it's milk oriented. So it's quite a literal sense of ingesting, but it has this double sense, like a lot of these terms of celebrating, milk as ground for life, but also saying you shouldn't kill that which produces in order to sustain life. So I guess methodologically, I'm not opposed to this at all. That's my way of doing it. So, thanks.
Sorry, Demetrius, you go for it. I was just going to add a sort of a pendant to.
I was too.
You go first, and then I'll.
Thank you.
You may very well say the same thing.
It's, great minds, yes.
You don't just press the same.
That's
I
right.
like t-shirt.
I think, Andrew, you kind of walked around Tristan's question, but saying it's a methodological dispute.
Yeah.
But I think there is a philosophical kind of weight to Tristan's question, because if it is possible to do some kind of historical, sociological, economical kind of analysis of the claim of eating or not eating animals, the question is that based on a kind of principle is that principle of excess that you described, of Zorge, of the unconditioned, of the without exception, to use all these different terms, the unoriginal kind of vulnerability, what I would call, as you know, being effectual, which means based on something that is outside instrumentality, or is it based alternatively that claim on something that presupposes instrumentality? So you talk about the law and you talk about justice, you have to presuppose instrumentality. The other famous kind of reference in antiquity for vegetarianism is Porphyry's De Absentia. And it starts with an account of justice that is precisely linked to dos infera, to calculation, right? So, I think there are two distinct possibilities there that are not merely a methodological kind of agreement, but carry some sort of fundamental philosophical question.
No, okay, fair enough. I agree with that. I was trying to be very specific in this instance. Yes, clearly my commitment is to what you're talking about is this notion of excess and this idea that I take from Arendt that our exposure allows us, as it were, to be enslaved, that we are vulnerable to that. And again, it's very interesting from my newfound interests in the way the Latin word dignitas will oscillate between your station, say, in life, but equally it refers to, in some instances, what we in modern English call dignity. And it's not until the Renaissance that it actually means dignity. But what's sort of interesting is that all of these terms, to me, point to this excessive quality that is vulnerable. So yes, I agree with you. I'm not going to dispute that there are then two philosophical ways through it. One is the idea of the following Porphyrian route, or the route I want to take, which is the one that is basically more, if you like, a commentary on Genesis 3, or on Hyginus, who is one of my heroes, I have to say, because I think that fable is just extraordinary in the way in which Kira occupies the human for the rest of their life. And I would argue that much like in the Genesis story, where into the mud is blown the breath of life, And that breath of life is what is always vulnerable, in the sense that life can become unlivable, and you can still be alive, can be reduced to your mere matter. And so, yes, I agree. I'm taking a stand, if you like, as an argument for the protection of the excess. So yes, thank you very much. That makes it much clearer in my mind. That is precisely.
That's where I disagree.
Yeah, sure. But that's absolutely. But that's precisely what I'm doing. So I really want to make a claim that, it builds slightly on Butler's notion of precarity, but it's not the same as that. It builds on other things that I found elsewhere. And I do think it's I'm very interested, because of my own background, I suppose, in why so many of the commandments are in the negative. Thou shalt not kill. I think Levinas is right about that. The reason why it's in the negative is because we can, and therefore we shall not. And I think there's something very interesting there in the way Jonas and Ovid, bizarrely, are both claiming that what really marks us out is our capacity to destroy, or our capacity to live violently. And therefore, and that's why the Lucretius part is so interesting. He said people got fed up with living with the violence of kings. But you couldn't just then impose the law. You had to lead people to a position in which they would, and I made it sound more kind than it really is, but I did that intentionally, where they willingly submit themselves. But that you could read that result clause as a willing submission to them. And so, yeah, I guess that's my project, and that's what I'm very interested in recovering. Though now you remind me, the Porphyry text is one I need to go back to, and I'd love to write more about on that. So yes, but my project is clearly outlined.
I'll go to you, Tom, your question, and then I'll ask mine.
Peter, hello.
Hi. Thanks for that, Andrew. I really enjoyed it, and such a such a sort of in-depth reading of a very important passage. I guess I wanted to ask you about just a sort of roadblock that I often come up against if I'm trying to mine Ovid for philosophical significance, and that is, he often kind of disables that sort of reading by being so self-undermining. So I think it's, the way that Pythagoras' speech is introduced, it's introduced in this interesting way, right? Where he opens his lips, with such words. He was the first to open his lips with such words, as if he's about to eat something, and then he delivers this speech. But that crucial little two words, non creditor, the lips that were not believed. So you couldn't really do much more to kind of write this speech off through its introduction. So what do you sort of make of that?
No, in the much longer version, thank you so much for that. In the other, I do note that, and it has two senses. You're right to say one reading is that it undermines it on one level. And so therefore, as Hardy points out, Pythagoras' speech is either taken to be the summation, much like Scipio's dream at the end of Cicero's Republic. It's like the culmination of everything, or it's ironic and should be dismissed as just an aberration. And I'm not sure what I think of that alternative, but I do think that the line you're pointing to, the way I want to do it, which is clearly not what's intended, is to say that its believability is something that you must come to. So it wasn't inherently believable, but it's something that can come to be believed. Mm-hmm. And so I do take it. In fact, I've noted it time and time again, those lines. And it's the the words weren't believed, the lips weren't believed, but it's therefore you have to ask the question of what's it like to come to believe something? What's it like to come to be persuaded by something? And I would then, make the claim that it's linked to this notion of
of education or being brought to a position that, etc., etc. So I would then want to read various elements within it to look at how their own notion, their own rhetoric of persuasion depended upon a lack of the self-evident. So the question of coming to believe it has to do with something not being self-evidently true, but might be brought to believe that something is true. So that's how I've dealt with that line.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we could also say that just because it's not believed, just because the audience isn't ready to hear it, doesn't mean that it's not true as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really fascinating. I've got so many things that I'm going to go and chase up. As a Latinist, I'm really interested in how the text that you're interrogating often push the reader in a position where they are enacting some of the kind of coordinates that you sketched at the start, like the role of empathy when you're reading. And so one of the moments in the speech where I thought was actually the moment of piling up visca or piling up tables. And one of the reasons why I think visca actually works very well for your argument, in my mind, is that it creates a sense of empathy in the reader because they're put in the position of either Thyestes suffering this nefas or Atreus committing this nefas. And it's the visca which puts us back with the kind of classic moment of that transgression where the kids are fed to their father. And I was wondering more generally about the role of the reader's empathy, manufacturing the reader's empathy in this speech through some of those textual effects like ora cruore, where you had that vivid moment of a mouth filled with blood, which is repeated in the speech. So yeah, I was really struck by that, and to me that sort of chimes with kura, although it's not a term that I need to sort of work out my own sort of sense of how that kind of works, but and where empathy and care are connected up in ancient texts.
Thank you very much. The empathy, the one clear example is when, he more or less says, how could you slit the throat of a calf when it's sounding or seeking its mother, which is a sound you've heard, and those sorts of things. So he plays on empathy a great deal through the dependence upon us projecting onto the animal a human characteristic, or the sounds of animals make us think of the human. And it's I've thought of this, a lot of this recently, when I was sitting, I forget, I was on a train, and I could hear a baby crying. And my children are in their 30s, so it's a long time ago. Yeah. But I recognized immediately that was the cry of a tired child that wanted to go to sleep. And everyone who's had a child would know that immediately. So there's something about sound, even if it's not your child, that you, in some sense, understand immediately. And it's not difficult to see that what Ovid's doing is playing, as it were, on the universality of sound to break the link between the human and the animal. So that even though when a child wants its mother or parents, it will make a different sound to a calf. Nonetheless, the sound that you hear, you would understand as the sound of an animal, of a young animal wanting its parents. And I think he plays on that a great deal. And so empathy, I think, does play a very interesting role within it. And then you have to sort of say, well, my argument, which is more a sort of philosophical argument, that the limit to empathy is that while it may bring about care and a desire to care, that care becomes ineffectual the moment it's separated from the question of justice. And therefore that's so I think that's what's interesting then of the references to law, both in Lucretius and in Ovid, although they're references to injury, are opening up something else.
Can I ask a quick, it's not quite a follow-up question, it's more like a tangential question.
Sure.
Because I love the connection between Inuria and Jus. And then the other main, I guess, word for law is fas, which is divine law. So I was wondering how this plays in or feeds in, or because it's often Nefander Epula that Ovid is talking about as well, and whether there's a distinction or it has a different kind of
Well, this takes me to Medea, because line 12 of the opening of Medea is where she says, given everything, my voce is that I have to set, I speak, I pray precor, is nephas. And so this notion of fast, that she is reduced to speaking in this sort of language, which is the opposite. And so there's then something very interesting about how that question of law and justice is mediated by a Medea having to speak. Pray rather. So I forget it was voce nefas precor or something. I will have to speak in a voice that's nefas. In other words, that she's positioned as injured from the very start by the language that she has to use.
I'm just going to follow up, not so much follow up on what Tristan was raising, but just a few things that ramified from that. One of the injunctions against not eating the ox is because this is an animal that's worked alongside you in the fields. So there's a kind of division of labour argument there, isn't there? That you don't eat the guy that you work with. And the division of labour brings us back to labour, which is what marks us as human, right? At least in Marxist anthropology, that we are the animal that labours, and so is the ox. And that draws me back to sacrifice, because the great anthropologist Jonathan Smith, when he was mediating between Walter Burkett and René Girard on the question of the meaning of sacrifice, points out that in antiquity, only domestic animals are sacrificed. You don't sacrifice wild animals. You rarely sacrifice dogs unless it's to Hecate. You don't sacrifice fish and things like that. It's always animals which are part of the familia, to so to speak, or the larger definition of the familia, and particularly the ox, which is never raised for meat. It's always raised as a working animal. And so the killing of the ox is actually impious in this kind of strange paradoxical way, and that's drawn particularly clearly by Paul Friedenhagen, essentially when he says the Athenians have this ritual called the Bufonia, which is the murder of the ox, and they're very cognizant that sacrifice involves an act of murder for which a trial must be held afterwards. You know, that's the famous scene where the knife is eventually found guilty and then hurled out from beyond the borders of Attica in this sort of theatrical way. But it comes back to this kind of paradox about sacrifice, that sacrifice is absolutely core to political community, because it's the political ritual par excellence, the division of meat amongst the group. And so the Pythagoreans renounced the city by renouncing meat. And yet at the same time, you know, that it's called impious and nefas. The very idea of sacrifice involves this kind of this idea of guilt, which Burkett, of course, makes a lot about, the guilt that is created by killing the animal. It just occurs to me, though, that the sort of the historical materialist or even the Marxist interpretation comes back to the idea of the ox as this worker that you work with, and that the community of man and animal comes from this realization that together we kind of produce the world together, and that the community of human and animal is kind of needs to be recognised through that as much as anything else.
Well, I don't think I'm going to argue that sits in opposition.
No, of course.
I don't, you know, I recognise that the fact Ovid does talk about precisely these sorts of issues of co-working, etc., etc. But I do think, and this is something that you and I talked about before, is that my approach to this, I'm not a historian, I do wish I'm someone I wish I knew more, but I'm very interested in Lucretius's critique of religion and sacrifice, and I'm very persuaded by a lot of that. And I think I'm very interested in what Lucretius is opposed to. He's not, I mean, he is not, as it were, an atheist. He's opposed to the link between religion and violence, and therefore wants to argue for what the suspension of violence is like. And he's very modern in that he realizes that this has nothing to do with a personal belief in the deity. It has something to do with whether or not you're committed to a life of violence. And so I guess I am privileging that aspect of it over other aspects, while recognizing that in the ancient world, sacrifice and the killing of animals has a much greater extension than Lucretius' critique is going to allow for. Nonetheless, I guess because I'm just very interested in why it is. I'm very interested in critiques of violence, to be honest with you. And that therefore, when Kant on the one hand will make an argument that is very close to the Lucretius argument, or vice versa, I then become interested in the way in which there are thinkers in the ancient world and in the more contemporary world for whom war, peace is not suspension. And there is a great, the most, I think, embarrassing understanding of peace is to see it as a suspension of war. And I think that Kant is absolutely right to think that peace is only possible between those two positions that commit themselves to living peaceably. And therefore it has nothing to do with the suspension of war. And I think that therefore you can ask the question, though it's going to have a very different, slightly different answer, what's it like to live in peace with animals? And that gets you round the sort of Peter Singer problem, whether you attribute rights to animals, which seems to me a non-starter as a question. And so therefore, my approach is to say, well, I want to defend the animal. How do I do that? Philosophically speaking, my interest is in a philosophical defense of vegetarians. What is it? I don't want to attribute rights to animals. I think rights arguments in general just don't work. However, I still want the end result is that we have a better way of dealing with our animal other. Therefore, what's the argument? What about if you live in peace with animals? Okay, what would it mean to be at war with animals? Becoming meat. So my argument has a utility for me that I know where I'm going. I just want to work out how you get there. And so deploying this material vis-a-vis the critique of religion, the critique of sacrifice, is the way of saying, even though sacrifice does play that role in the ancient world, it's also true that there were arguments against it. And I suppose that while there were minor arguments compared to what the majority of people thought, I'm always interested in the fact that there is some notion of contestation over the content of a belief, or more importantly, the content of practice in the ancient world.
But that's I think why the Buffonian description in Porphyry is really useful, because the idea pops up then that the animal is owed justice for that, and your definition of pax, which is linked etymologically to our word pact, right? Which is got nothing to do with the opposite of with a banal notion of peace, but it has everything to do with and it has certainly nothing to do with some sort of intrinsic or universal or essentializing notion of rights. But it has everything to do with a deal. We make a deal, right? Yeah, sure. Because the pax deorum is also like the deal that we have with the gods, right? A quid pro quo, and it's politics then. So we need to kind of sit down with animals and do it kind of like.
Well, that would be what I wanted to argue, and that's why I'm emphasising our installation of the vita activa, or the notion of activity. So it's not a static thing that you do it and then it's over, we don't need to forget about it, but it involves a continuity of practice.
Hence Lucretius's idea about the installation of the legal process.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Yeah. Yulia has popped in the chat an image of it looks like a fish sacrifice. So contradicting.
Yeah. You've been fact checked.
I've been fact checked, exactly. So I'm just going to share that so that people can see it. There it is there. It looks like a fish sacrifice, or perhaps it looks like a fish being cut up or being prepared. The dogs are happy, aren't they? But it does look like a festival kind of context given the garlands that they're wearing.
Or it could be AI generated.
Yes, you didn't AI generate that. Did you? What is she replied in the chat?
There is an altar.
There is an altar, yes. Okay. So well, perhaps it could very well be a
maybe it was a pet fish.
Domestic dish.
I'd love to know who the divinity is. Maybe Poseidon. But look, if there are no more questions, you have a follow-up.
Can I just say something?
Yes.
at the risk of embarrassing him or putting him on the spot, I'll just shout out to Dinesh's book, The War Against Animals, which I would recommend you read.
I didn't, sorry, my shame, Dinesh, I didn't know of your book until 2 or 3 days ago. I'm embarrassed by this, but I will read it. I thought, it's one of those arrogantly stupid things that you do. I thought I'd thought of this. And then I Googled war with animals and found your book, thereby proving that one never thinks of anything original. But no, I don't know how similar our arguments are, but I don't know the book yet, but I will do. But I think it's a very interesting, claim, and I think it gets round the, rights arguments, and it locates then the argument about the relationship to the animal in a general, a larger philosophical argument that I worked with my friend here who used to work here, Francesco Borghese. We did a lot of work on the concept of Pax and Concordia in the Renaissance. And it doesn't involve animals, but it does open up this notion that even the idea of peace and concord has some notion, so that you would then ask, is there a concordia with the animal? As opposed, so there is a language to talk about relationality that in some sense is premised upon, the suspension of war as being the dominant motif. And again, philosophically, this is very important to me because one of the things that I find so difficult is Carl Schmitt's claim that the notion of politics needs the enemy. And I want to sort of get rid of this. And one way of doing it is to really emphasize modes of relationality, like peace, concord, etc., etc. And then ask the question of, what has to hold in order that this is brought about. And so the suspension of war, if you like, doesn't take place because war's ghastly, though it is. It takes place in the name of something like concord and peace. And the work that my friend Francesco is no longer here, now lives in Italy, we did on looking at the notion of concordia in the Renaissance, for me at least, was really structured around that sort of project of recovering a thinking of these issues, and you worked on this. So this is very, to my mind, this is part of the same project of looking at the history of thought to find moments in which they have a redemptive quality.
Shall I say a few words now that Tristan's kindly put me on the spot?
Yes, please.
I just want to say thank you for the paper. It's really fascinating, Andrew. We actually met about 20 years ago, so it's really nice to see, at a conference, Derrida conference or something like that. So it's nice to see you present again. And I suspect you'd find the book interesting, though I think you would probably come at it through different routes, and obviously with an emphasis on the classical scholarship, which is fascinating. It'd be fascinating to chat about it. I did want to one thing I wanted to just say, but I was really interested in this tension in your paper between violence as a problem for justice and the ethical problem of consuming the products of violence. So these two things, and the reason I want to, they seem to come up in your reading as a tension or a space of a blurry space. And I just say that, to me, this is almost a classical question, right? In that if we look at, say, I know like Hindu, Jainist ethics, this is also this tension, right? That ahimsa, there's this sort of prohibition on violence or tendency towards seeing violence as a problem, as contaminating, but also that the products of violence are contaminating. But maybe related to this question about modern day production, one thing that marks capitalist production is the absolute separation between the consumption commodity that we eat and the concealment of the site of production. So to me, I think there's an interesting tension the way this materializes today that is sitting in your paper, right? So it was just a comment more than anything, but I was curious about your thoughts about that distinction between violence as a problem of justice, the site of violence, and the product of violence, i.e. meat.
No, that's very good. I mean, you're right. Your point made towards the end is right. That there is a separation that makes the product not, it's not being linked to its source. You don't see it as the site, the result of a founding violence. That's true. And that is necessary for the meat industry to function. Otherwise, our modern sensibility couldn't cope with the meat industry. But I think, that therefore, really, the force of the distinction is that that the products of violence, one has to make the argument, are inextricably bound up with the source of the violence, and that really, therefore, a very mechanistic position that to the extent that it's possible to live in peace with animals, it's then possible for there not, the elimination of the founding violence would mean that there would no longer be that, as it were, product of violence. But I do think that historically, that distinction is, I mean, if you look at one of my interests is to look at the history of painting and the way in which animals are presented within it, and the paintings of butcher shops, Rembrandt's extraordinary and carcass. There was a time in which we confronted happily the meat industry as something that was celebrated in works of art. We no longer do that. And indeed, when Lady Gaga, wore the meat jacket, if you remember, this is a great moment in my life, that it was just so confronting, because all of a sudden, what should have been something that one consumed happily was made both attractive and repellent at the same time. And as a statement, it was quite dramatic. And so it brought to us that violence that was dressed up as being dressed up. And so I think there are lots of ways in which one can begin to unpack this, but I think that the end point of the product of violence is only overcome by the recognition that peace is an actual possibility. But to get to that stage necessitates, the boring old practice of education. But thank you.
One could add that the commodity itself is, all commodities are the product of a concealment of violence, right?
Yeah.
Well, but this is that's like the Walter Benjamin argument that I agree with. That every document of culture is also a document of art. I think as a generalization, I'm not going to dispute that. However, there is something specific here about meat that I want to make an argument in relation to. But at the general point, I take every iPhone, which we all have them, is the result of child labour. The minerals that are used to create it are taken from mines that have the most appalling conditions. We all happily use iPhones. So it's true that every document of culture is a document of art. Nonetheless, the specificity is what I'm interested in.
And the critique of religion that is also in Ovid, as well as in Lucretius, is to some extent undone by the claim of Pythagoras to be speaking from a position of Bartius, right, as a seer.
Well, that's the very, well, yes, like with every good question.
He was also somebody who examines the entrails.
Yeah, that's true. Contextually, that is true. It must be a yes/no answer. Yes, you're right. But no, it's not, because the nature of the education necessitates a founding symmetry. Right. So we don't understand education for the we're all in, because we're not. And but it's how that hierarchy is then understood that makes education possible. And so therefore there's another reading of that word that contextualizes, yes, the reading of entrails, etc., etc. Nonetheless, what's being promulgated is a position held by an educator. Okay. So, but I do take the point. I mean, that's why in the end you don't want to insist that everything Ovid says is right.
No, true.
Valuable, and one has to. I mean, not that you're not doing this, but nuance is absolutely essential.
Well, I mean, I'll throw to Tristan to have the last word, but the word "fas" indicates ultimately too the kind of the architecture of the annual calendar of sacrifices as well, right? So that one of the king's primary sort of functions in Rome in the earliest times to define which days of the year are fast and which are not. In other words, what are the right days on which to kind of hold sacrifices, hold market days and things like that. But effectively, what's been said here by Saint Nefas is that there are no days of the year that are in which that it satisfies to kill another
Without
thing,
exception.
without exception.
Well, that's the
I think we're gonna have to go back around to Vaticanare because that's from fatu or to speak, but then.
It does,
Yeah,
but all of these words come back to verbs of speaking. Yours
That's right.
also comes from oath swearing, sort of, it's sort of something to do with sort of fast, yeah, farmer, fast, farter, and so on. Yeah. And femi in Greek, I deny or I assert.
Yeah.
Tristan,
No, it's fine, the moment's passed.
you think? Oh, really? Okay, well, look, wow, okay, very productive, very thought-provoking. I never thought for a moment that it would be. It was always going to be great. And you honour us and our workshop by giving this paper here for us. And let's just thank Andrew again.